Hard problems are more solvable than we've been told. The three calculations that change what's possible. Hard problems don't stay hard because they're unsolvable. They stay hard because the leaders working on them are increasingly making decisions calibrated to a world that no longer exists. And because the people who could lead aren't. Often they believe the barriers are too high. The problems this series examines affect hundreds of millions or billions of people across borders and sit inside systems, laws, markets, infrastructure, and norms that no single institution controls and no single actor can fix alone. That is what we mean by hard. The cost assumptions were formed, for example, when satellite imagery required government contracts and physical surveys cost hundreds of dollars per household. The timeline expectations were formed when reaching 1 billion people required a decade of institutional negotiation. The dependency assumptions were formed when the only route to scale was via multilateral agencies, bilateral funders, and the slow physics of government procurement cycles. Those assumptions were reasonable once. They are now actively misleading. This series introduces three calculations that turn hard problem rhetoric into concrete numbers that de-risk working on hard problems and clarify where to put scarce time, capital, and attention. The conditions have changed. The tools available to a leader working on a hard problem today are not incrementally better than the tools available in 2010. They are categorically different in cost, reach, and speed. Across sectors, the unit economics of key enabling technologies have collapsed. Global average costs for digital identity verification checks are now around 20 US cents and are projected to fall further as volume scales. High-resolution satellite imagery and remote sensing have driven the per-parcel cost of land measurement far below that of legacy labor-intensive field surveys, making the parcel-level mapping technically and financially feasible at national scale. India's Unified Payments Interface, UPI, processed about 172 billion transactions in 2024, over 14 billion per month, illustrating the scale of low-cost, real-time digital payments. Brazil's instant payment system, Pix, has reached more than 170 million users, roughly 93% of the country's adult population, without relying on dense physical branch networks. AI-powered tools for legal and compliance workflows are already delivering large time and cost savings, suggesting that specialized land tenure documentation can similarly see order of magnitude reductions in per case costs. For example, AI document intelligence platforms automate review, extraction, and drafting across complex legal documents. In agriculture, emerging AI agronomy platforms use data-driven recommendations to scale soil analysis, crop planning, and pest detection across many farms, sharply lowering the marginal cost of advice once the system is deployed. These demonstrate changed conditions. The hard problems are still hard. The people still waiting for socioeconomic, environmental, health, and education solutions are still waiting. What has changed is the set of tools available to the leaders who decide to act, and therefore what we should expect of those leaders and of ourselves. The changing conditions is about what existing leaders can do, and it's also about who can lead. For most of the last half-century, working seriously on hard problems required a specific kind of entry ticket: institutional affiliation, large funding bases, decades of relationship building with gatekeepers who controlled access to beneficiaries, governments, and legitimacy. The problems were large enough that only large actors could reach them, which meant the universe of people who could act credibly was, by definition, small. That constraint is dissolving. The same cost curves that have made high-resolution satellite and GPS-based mapping, vastly cheaper than traditional household field surveys now make them accessible to a team of 20 as readily as to a multilateral agency. The same digital identity rails that have pushed average per-person onboarding costs down to well under $1 do not discriminate between an established NGO and a leader who incorporated last year. The infrastructure that used to require institutional scale to access is becoming, in domain after domain, a public good, which means the question of who is structurally positioned to move a hard problem is no longer answered by looking at who has the biggest budget or the longest track record. It is answered by looking at who has run the three calculations and who is willing to act on what they find. There is a third implication that follows on from all of this. Some leaders who run the three calculations will find that the structural agency available to them has already outrun the ambition they've been willing to declare. That the limiting factor is no longer infrastructure, capital, or institutional permission. That what they've been calling being realistic is just staying calibrated to an older world. The three calculations have a side effect. On the one hand, they make bolder goals possible. On the other hand, they make smaller goals harder to justify. Not more ambition, more precision. Specifically, the three calculations that the most effective organizations working on hard problems are already running, and most leaders have not yet made. This series applies the three calculations to 12 of the world's hardest problems. This piece explains what the calculations are, where they come from, and why all three are necessary before any of them is sufficient. The first calculation, the crossover point. In the 1930s, Theodore Wright was studying the economics of aircraft manufacturing when he noticed something that would later be generalized across almost every industry in the world. Every time cumulative production of a given technology doubled, the cost fell by a predictable percentage, not randomly, not occasionally, reliably, across industries, across decades, across technologies, with nothing in common, except that humans were making more of them and getting better at it. Wright's law is now one of the most empirically robust findings in the economics of technology and cost decline, as shown in the overview of Wright's law and learning curves, and the image is shown in the article. It has been validated in solar panels, semiconductors, batteries, DNA sequencing, and dozens of other technologies. The implication for hard problems is specific and underused. The cost of the tools needed to address most hard problems is falling on a predictable curve, which means the moment at which a structural solution becomes cheaper than the system's cost of doing nothing is calculable, not guessed at, not hoped for, but calculated. That moment is the crossover point. The crossover point asks one question: when does a structural solution become cheaper than the system's cost of doing nothing? And what will it take to bring your model to that point faster? Before it, a leader working on a hard problem is competing against inertia with more expensive tools than the incumbent. Every partnership comes with conditions. Every funding relationship carries compromise risk. The institutional gatekeepers hold the leverage because they control the only viable route to scale. After it, inertia works in the other direction. The institution's cheapest option is now to adopt what that leader built because it's cheaper than continuing to do nothing. This is also when the model becomes commercially viable, not as a byproduct of mission, but structurally. After the crossover point, a leader is not competing against a better funded incumbent. They are operating with a lower cost base than the institution whose inertia they just outrun. The focus is not so much a mission, it shifts to being a market position. The cost of inaction is not zero, it is large and measurable. We can see it in three domains that are unusually well quantified. Every US $1 invested in deworming returns an estimated US $169 in productivity and long-term earnings. Rigorous analysis suggests every US $1 invested in family planning can generate on the order of US $7 in direct public sector savings in high income settings, and as much as $100 US plus in wider social and economic benefits in low and middle income countries. Best available analysis suggests that investing in agricultural research and development can return more than $20 to $30 US in benefits for every $1 US invested. The cost of institutional inaction in lost productivity, compounding health burden, and systematic fragility, for example, is calculable in almost every hard problem domain. In almost every domain, the crossover point exists, is calculable, and yet is rarely calculated first. It should be. The second calculation, the choke point map. For decades, institutional intermediaries controlled the only viable path to scale, to beneficiaries, to funders, to governments, and to legitimacy. That control is eroding. In some places, it's already gone. Digital public infrastructure shows what this looks like in practice. India's unified payments interface and Brazil's PIX have made low-cost real-time payments available at population scale on rails that no single institution owns. Digital identity and eKYC have pushed per-person onboarding costs down to well under $1 in many markets. Community members in countries like Ghana are using mobile and geospatial tools to help map land boundaries and feed data into formal systems. AI-assisted legal tools are expanding what paralegals and frontline legal workers can do by automating routine tasks and freeing scarce central expertise for the edge cases. Rather than being incremental improvements, they demonstrate what happens when essential infrastructure becomes a public good rather than a proprietary asset. At every choke point, a leader is still routing through a point of leverage that someone else holds over their mission. The organizations working most effectively on hard problems are the ones that mapped out those choke points early and either routed around them or built in the infrastructure that made them irrelevant. This is not just operational efficiency, it's the recovery of agency. It's how an organization earns the structural ability to say no to a bad relationship, decline a distorting grant, or hold a position under pressure without fearing consequences. The choke point map has 4 domains: people, money, data, and legitimacy. In each domain, the question is the same: who can slow, veto, or tax your path from outcome unit to scale? The critical distinction within each domain is between structural choke points, those that exist because of law, physics, or irreducible constraint, and legacy choke points, those that exist because of habit, assumption, and interests of actors who benefit from treating negotiable gates as permanent ones. In almost every hard problem domain, at least one choke point treated as permanent 5 years ago is now negotiable. Finding it before incumbents consolidate around new tools is a strategic advantage with a closing window. The choke point map is how you find it and how you distinguish the gates worth routing around from the ones that are genuinely structural. The third calculation, the voltage test. Economist John List identified what he called the voltage drop in his book, The Voltage Effect: How to Make Good Ideas Great and Great Ideas Scale, the phenomenon by which a large share, often 50 to 90% of programs that work in pilots, fail at scale. This was not caused by bad ideas or insufficient funding. It was chef dependency, models built around a founder's presence, judgment, and relationships rather than replicable logic. When the founder moved on, the funding changed, or the political context shifted, and the model lost its voltage. In addition to it stopping work, it also started making compromising decisions on the way down, accepting distorted funding, narrowing its mandate, or drifting from its original purpose, because it had no structural alternative. The voltage test asks one question: does your model work when you're not in the room? More specifically, does it work when the government changes, the funder pivots, and the founding team moves on? Most programs fail this test, not because the idea is wrong, but because the design was never asked to answer it. The founder's presence was assumed. The funder's continuity was assumed. The political momentum was assumed. When those assumptions broke, the model broke with them. The organizations that score highest in any serious assessment of hard problem impact all have solved this problem, though not all the same way. Prantham's teaching at the right level works rather without its founders in the room and has been adapted and implemented by governments and partners across India, Africa, and beyond, reaching more than 80 million children. Namati built Grassroots Justice Network, now over 16,600 rather 16,600 members from 175 countries on a model designed from the outset to put the power of law in people's hands rather than central offices. Landesa works with governments to design and implement national land laws and programs that are field tested, financially and politically feasible, and explicitly intended to function at scale without Landesa present in every community. One Acre Fund used a revolving loan structure in which farmer repayments are recycled into the following season, enabling the model to operate and grow through system design rather than founder oversight. What made building voltage-proof models hard was time. Historically, it took decades of iteration to embed a model's logic in systems rather than people. The constraint is dissolving. Agentic AI systems that execute multi-step processes, adapt to local variation, and operate without constant human oversight is more than a productivity tool. It's a scaling architecture. The voltage test is now answerable in the design phase, not in the scaling phase. Leaders who ask, how does this work without me, before they ask, how do we grow, are building something structurally different from every previous generation of mission-driven organization. While all three are necessary, each calculation is insufficient alone. A leader who calculates the crossover point but hasn't mapped the choke points will arrive at the right moment through the wrong route, dependent on institutional gatekeepers who will extract rent for access at exactly the moment the leader needs independence most. A leader who maps the choke points but hasn't run the voltage test will build something that works brilliantly in the pilot and collapses when they leave because the model's logic lived in their judgment rather than in replicable systems. A leader who passes the voltage test but hasn't calculated the crossover point will build something durable and permanently subscale because the economic logic that would make it the rational choice for governments and commercial capital to adopt never got calculated, and the model stays dependent on philanthropic subsidy when it could have been self-funding. Together, the three calculations produce something different from any one of them, a map of leverage, not analysis of the problem. Every domain has that. A map of when to move, how to move without permission, and what to build so that what you build holds. The map the three calculations produce. The three calculations are not a checklist. They are three different lenses, economic, structural, and architectural, that produce different information. Their value compounds at the intersections. We can picture them as three overlapping circles. One, the crossover point and the choke point map together. Without the voltage test, they produce an opportunity window. You know when the economics work and you know the routes that don't require institutional permission, you can see that a move is possible and viable. What you cannot see is whether what you build will hold when you step back. This is where most well-funded initiatives live. They found the right moment and got in through the right door, but the model depends on the founder's continued presence to function. The window is real. The model won't last. 2, the choke point map and the voltage test together without the crossover point produce the durable but scalable model. You know how to move without institutional permission, and you've built something that holds without you. The routes are clear and the architecture is sound. What you haven't calculated is where the economics tip in your favor, so the model stays dependent on philanthropic subsidy rather than becoming the rational choice for governments and commercial capital to adopt. This is where many of the best mission-driven organizations live, genuinely independent, genuinely voltage-proof, permanently undercapitalized because the commercial case was never made. 3, the crossover point and the voltage test together without the choke point map produce a stranded asset. You know the economics work and you've built something durable, but you're still routing through institutional gatekeepers to reach the people the problem affects. The model is real and the timing is right, but the route is controlled by someone else. This is where promising models get captured, absorbed by the institutions they were meant to route around, or forced into compromise partnerships because the permissionless alternatives were never mapped. At the center, all three calculated together, is the map of leverage itself. when to move, how to move without permission, what to build so that your build holds. This is also where commercial viability and mission integrity stop being in tension. The crossover points tell you when the economics work. The choke point map tells you how to capture the value without routing it through extractive intermediaries. The voltage tests tells you how to build something that compounds rather than depletes. Together, they describe an organization that doesn't have to choose between surviving and doing what it said it would do. Across 12 editions, this series will show where current responses to each hard problem are stuck, which intersection they're in, and what the missing calculation would change. The pattern that emerges is the argument. The outcome unit. Beneath all three calculations is one prior requirement that most leaders working on hard problems have not met: the outcome unit. The outcome unit is the atomic binary verifiable result, not education, but one child reading at grade level, not land rights, but one household with verified digitally registered tenure, not financial inclusion, but one person with an active account used in the last 90 days, not health access, but one person who received the treatment the evidence says works, verified by independent data. Without a precise outcome unit, the crossover point cannot be calculated. You cannot price what you cannot define. The choke point map can't be completed. You cannot identify the route to the outcome if the outcome is a category rather than a result. The voltage test cannot be passed. You cannot embed replicable logic in systems if the logic depends on a founder's judgment about what counts as access. The outcome unit is not academic precision for its own sake. It is the foundation that makes agency real. A leader can only credibly say no to a distorting grant, a compromising partnership, a mandate that would narrow the mission if they can prove they are winning without the partner they are declining. The outcome unit is what makes that proof possible. This series, the Soft Power Brief, is a 12-part series on the problems the world is still waiting to solve. Each edition takes one hard problem from current expert analysis and runs all three calculations on it, showing what the crossover point looks like in that domain, where the legacy choke points are and what has made them negotiable, and what voltage proof model would need to look like to hold at scale. The framework in this series comes directly from work I do with leaders and organizations who are turning their soft power into leverage on hard problems. The problems are different. The calculations are the same. Across 12 domains, the same pattern appears. Institutions fail. Technology companies move into the space they left and monetize the problem rather than solve it. And a specific kind of leader fills the gap between the two. That leader is not defined by sector, credential, or budget. They are defined by structure. And that structure is identifiable before they act, not just recognized after they succeed. The barriers to serious work on hard problems are falling. The leverage available to a leader who runs the three calculations is rising. What remains, the only thing that remains, is the question of which problem you care enough to drive a solution to, and whether your strategy is calibrated to the conditions that exist right now. That is a personal question before it is a strategic one. The soft power assessment, the soft power index, the links are in the article, will show you what you are actually holding across 6 domains, not credentials, not track record, but the structural assets that determine where your leverage is highest. 12 hard problems follow. By the end, you will have enough to decide where your impact will be highest over the next 1 to 5 years. By edition 12, if you've read and played along, you'll know 3 things: which problems your soft power fits, which ones you could stop pretending you're the right person to lead, if any, and if you've been wondering whether you have a role to play, which problem you'll commit to over the next 1 to 5 years. We've been operating inside a system we've been operating inside a frame someone else set. This series is the way out of it. What's on the other side is a clearer picture of what we're all capable of and what becomes possible when we each act on that.